Good evening and welcome to the Legion Cantina. In today's episode, we're going to be going through the process I go through when I'm building a rebel list and some sort of tips and tricks for how you can approach rebel list building in general. So, I guess the best place to start is kind of having an overall look at what the rebel faction does well and what it doesn't do so well, and then sort of some key overall things you can think about when you're building a list. I'm also going to talk about sort of different types of units, how you can use them, and how they sort of synergize together. And then also talk about sort of deployment, how you can manage the early turns of the game, and sort of thinking about objectives and the relative skill that maybe different units require to use. So, the key aspects of the Rebel faction. Anybody who's watched the unit guides will know what I'm going to come around to here. The majority of the units in your army without defensive support or defensive tech are going to be quite weak. Relying on rebel saves in the new version of the game is quite challenging, and a lot of the time, if your units are caught out in the open, or even if they are in cover, sometimes they are just going to melt because those white saves do just seem to crumble away very quickly these days. One of the big advantages of the Rebel faction, though, is they have access to some of the best special forces and operative options in the game. You can look at things like Bad Batch, Sleeper Cell, IG, Din Djarin, Bistan Pathfinders, even the Ewok Slingers are just an excellent value unit. Like, there is some real power in those slots, and that's kind of where the Rebel faction seems to excel. The downsides to Rebel faction as well are talking about like order control. This is something that I think is most acute with the Rebel faction. I think Empire can have a few issues with this as well, and Gar to a maybe a lesser extent, and obviously droids. This is sort of not an issue they ever really have to deal with unless you're running a very skewed list towards heroes. But yeah, I mean, very often you're only going to have 3 or 4 units who are being given orders on a typical turn with rebels, which means on average you're going to have 7 or 8 in the bag, which means things like improv and also units that don't necessarily mind when they get an order are quite important in the rebel faction for sort of consistency and making sure your list does what you want it to do. Some key considerations that I have when I make a list are, is this being aimed at competitive or casual? A list can be both, and a lot of it's how about you approach the game. Like, there's nothing wrong with taking a very competitive list in a casual setting, as long as you're, bearing in mind the people you're playing and not trying to maybe optimize everything to the extent that you might do in a tournament setting. The next 2 ones are maybe more specific to kind of things what I'm going to be talking about today. It's, are you building around a specific model or playstyle, and are you looking to counter a specific model or playstyle? And yeah, these are sort of considerations that would definitely on the more competitive end if you are thinking about this. I mean, you can definitely build a sort of casual list around a specific model playstyle, but I think in a casual setting, if you're looking to counter a specific playstyle or a specific model, that's maybe not what a casual game is all about. So for rebel list building, where do you start? I tend to just pick like literally anything that can even remotely relate to a list. As it says here, this can be so many different things: playstyle units, if you're countering somebody, if you're looking to get some unit synergy going, or if you're looking to build around a particular theme. Like, this isn't something that Legion does super well. Like, I think this would be something that would be with the battle forces maybe coming out in the future. Fingers crossed. It would be really nice to see, some other options. Something built around like Cassian and Jyn, maybe, like that would be really nice. Or something, around like the Mandalorian Resistance with Sabine or something. Like, something in those 2 areas would really add to the theme. But if you are building around a playstyle, like, this is probably maybe more of a competitive idea than a casual idea, but again, it can be both. And there are so many different options that you can kind of approach with a playstyle idea. Like, it can be gunline, melee, if you want to chuck some vehicles in, if you want it to be super maneuverable, tauntauns, bandos, whatever. That rebel, I think it was Echo Base, the one that won a tournament. It was like 21 activations or something. It was some like naked rebel vets with the Mark II blaster with them as well, and they had like 21 acts or something. Like, that looks quite interesting. Firstly expensive, but also could be quite interesting to play. And then, if nothing else, a safe default is just putting Bad Batch in, because I think they are by quite some distance Rebel's best bet at the moment. In that way, If you're building around a unit, there are a couple of build arounds, I think, in Rebels. Like, I think Op Luke, if you use them correctly, can be a build around. I think Bad Batch, they don't even necessarily have to be built around. Like, you can just put them in and they'll function absolutely by themselves. But they're definitely a unit that you can base, because they're actually going to be around into the late game, hopefully, that you can actually base an army around. Han has enough upside, I think, that it's worth building around him sometimes, try and keep him alive, or, get him to excel in those sort of mid-range kind of duels that he does so well in. You can even build around Leia if you want to. Like, that's more of a support role, which I'll talk about in a second. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with building around Leia. I quite like to put Leia in, and she is a centerpiece of a lot of my lists. If you're countering something, like, you can maybe just skew against them a bit. Like, if you're thinking of countering clones, you're going to be looking for more Pierce, things like that. If you're against EXD, nothing wrong with chucking in a bunch of Ion, like the Ion gun for the Rebel troopers at range 3 is a really solid bet, and it's a decent gun anyway, even if you're not using the Ion. But yeah, it's really nice. Tempest again, try and get some impact, although it's quite difficult to get hold of in Rebels, and a bit of Ion again sprinkled in won't do you any damage. Unit synergies, I think, are quite cool, and I'm hoping, again, if we do see some reworks for Jyn, Cassian, Lando, whatever, that we see a bit more of this being put in, because I think this is a really cool thing that Rebels do. You got the hand chewy thing, the Leia Wicket thing, Jyn and losing the game. Also Cassian, K2 as well. But yeah, there are some options there as well if you want to put those in. And then, as I mentioned, thematic moments, all of these are possible. I think Hoth, well, as I've just said earlier with the 21-act Rebel Vet, Echo base list is not bad, and I think if that's your cup of tea, absolutely go for it. You can also go, like, I think double airspeed or something if you want to chuck those in, or a bunch of supports with the Tauntauns and the laser cannon and stuff is not bad. Endor isn't quite what it used to be in a competitive sense. You used to be able to absolutely spam the acts with the Ewoks, but now it's gone up to 1,000. That feels less impactful, and there are maybe other lists that do it better. But it's still cool, and synergies with that Chewie ATST and stuff like that could be quite nice. And then if you want to chuck a bunch of fleets in and layer and say you're boarding the Tantive 4, then absolutely, that is technically a thematic list as well. But I think those are kind of your best options right now. So you've decided what you want to do, and now you're thinking about selecting units. I will say at this point, I am not giving advice as a exceptionally good Legion player. I would describe myself as a slightly above average Legion player. If I'm at a tournament, I'll normally be going 2-1 or 1-2, and I'm nearly always on the 1-1 table coming into the final round. So I'm never going to sort of go out there and absolutely blitz and win a tournament currently, but I have played quite a lot of Legion, and I think I have a reasonable grasp of what's going on. So this is just how I tend to think of things, but there are absolutely different ways of phrasing this, and like, it is in some ways simplistic to try and squeeze units into 3 categories, but this is just sort of, for me, how it makes it more straightforward. So hopefully that makes sense. So first of the 3 categories is the objective players. These are units that can get to an objective and will be able to stay there. Whether this is Bad Batch scoring at range 1, so they don't actually have to be that close, or if it's a unit like Op Luke or even Ahsoka, to be honest, is arguably survival enough. Din Djarin can do this as well, like, get to an objective and just survive long enough to actually score it and be a meaningful threat. It's a bonus if they have a way of dealing with other units that might be near the objective. So I think one of the things that makes Din Djarin so interesting is that flamethrower. Like, that is a big threat, and with his his relentless 1-pip, like, it does give you some really good options to actually clear an objective by himself. Bad Batch don't have that damage upside in my experience. Like, I've used them quite a few times now, and they're never like stunning in terms of damage. They're solid, and with like Hunt's ability there as well, you can sprinkle a bit of extra damage in. That's quite good. Obviously, Op Luke gives you that, option for force push and things like that. I think in terms of raw damage, Luke isn't somebody who can completely clear an objective by himself, unless you're kind of high rolling on Son of Skywalker. But it's still definitely something that, like, Luke can do in terms of scoring objectives with force push, things like that. The second ones are like your damage dealers. So these are units that aren't necessarily camping on an objective, as it were. They might be a little bit further back, or they might be sort of closer, but their primary goal isn't to score those objectives. It is more sort of focused on dealing damage to the opponent. So in Rebels, for me, this tends to fit into one of 2 categories. It can be that sort of longer range chip damage in inverted commas, although Pathfinders can sometimes be a bit more than that. Or, the 1.4 FD laser, or even a laser cannon on an AT-RT. Like, that's a nice bit of plink damage, and it's quite consistent. So these are units that are focused on dealing sort of consistent amounts of damage, whether that's a lot in one go at maybe shorter range with Sleeper Cell or Fleet, or that longer range chip damage with the Pathfinders and the Laser. And then for me, there's a third category, which is support units. These will not be focused on either of the above, so they haven't got great offensive output, and they're not sort of survivable enough maybe to stand an objective by themselves. But they enable other units in your army to be more effective. So layer, officer, bus, whatever you want, like these are all units that enable other things in your army to be more effective. And I think like rebels have some really decent options for those. Like I think the bus can be excellent value for generating aims and for generating dodges, and you know, want to put the medic on there or whatever, like it can be really good in that supportive role. So how does this translate into list building? So for me, if I was to try and construct a meta inverted commas rebel list, it would probably look something like this. I haven't run this list, but I think this takes a lot of things that rebels do well and it sort of maximizes them. So I think the layer wicket combo is really good. There is an argument for Han here, and I think you could definitely drop wicket and layer, put in Han, and then maybe chuck an upgrade or two on the rebel troopers or something. You know, definitely an astromech in here could be potentially quite useful, or a medic if you can squeeze one in. But I just prefer layer and wicket over Han. I've never quite fully got the grasp of Han, and he's definitely powerful in this new edition. He's just not something that I've ever played particularly well with. And then in the operative slot, got Bad Batch and IG. I think these are the two best options for rebel operatives right now. I think Bad Batch are incredibly consistent and give rebels something that they're not good at, which is scoring objectives. And sorry, rebels can score objectives, but they give you a unit that is sufficiently strong that it can hold an objective kind of by itself without needing much support. IG is similarly independent, but in a different kind of way. He can plink damage off at long range, or if you want to run him in with his 1-pip and his 3-pip explosion card as well, like there is some real up close and personal threat to him, so he can kind of do a bit of both. Naked Rebel Troopers, I think, are sadly probably the most efficient way to run them, because I think Rebel Troopers struggle to excel as a shooting unit. I think they can kind of do it, but I think it's almost better to save the points there and then put it somewhere else. One unit of fleets I think is always nice. I've never found a unit of fleets with a scattergun to feel like a particularly poor decision. Like they always have some kind of utility, and they do present enough of a threat that opponents will have to be wary of them. Double Sleeper Cell with the Astro is just incredibly consistent, and for 75 points you're getting 12 Surging Black, normally with an aim. Obviously it doesn't always happen like that, but they excel at playing near objectives and dealing damage in and around those sort of range 2, range 3 kind of areas, and yeah, that's just really strong for Sleeper Cell. So 2 lots of Sleeper Cell I think is never going to be a bad bet. Pathfinders with Bistan, I prefer to take extra upgrades on them, but in this list you can't fit them in, so this is just a very consistent shooting unit that will sit further back and just plink off a bit of damage. And then 2 ATR2s with a laser cannon. This is just such a bargain unit. Like for 60 points, it's just incredibly efficient. And I was actually thinking about this earlier. In a lot of ways, they're quite similar to the Droideka. They're in and around the same price point. They both have the ability to sort of remove damage for free, as it were, whether that's with the shields or with the Rebel ATRT Armor 2. It's got 6 health, like it's just tougher than a normal core unit. And with the laser cannon, it's going to be shooting turn 1 with that, with the scout. Yeah, and to top all off, their line of sight blocking, and if you can see the unit, they give heavy cover. Like it just does lots of stuff really well, and I think for protecting Sleeper Cell, for protecting like Wicket and Layer, even in this list, even like fleets as well, like just super consistent. Like you don't necessarily expect them to make it to the late game, but I think they really do give you something useful. Personally, I'd run 2 with the cannon, 1 with the flamer. Flamers are more of like statement of intent than an actual weapon. You're going to be very lucky if you ever get to fire the flamer in a meaningful way. Normally your opponent is going to blow them up well before they actually reach you. So yeah, while it is nice, there's those high roll potentials with the surge crit and the flamer. It doesn't always come off, but definitely a scary thing that your opponent will have to deal with. But yeah, I've kind of put the categories I think each unit kind of fits into. I think Wicket is a bit of objective and a support. The mainly support aspect is because he enables Leia to gain extra dodges from his Forest Dwellers and from his independent dodge, like in that aspect. I would never run Wicket as a damage dealer. Like his red black on his spear is nice, and it's normally good for 2 wounds, but you shouldn't be building around a damage output of 2 wounds from your hero. Like that's not going to be profitable for you long term. Leia is almost definition of a support hero. Improv Scanner is super efficient here. Could probably drop Scanner if you wanted to, put the points elsewhere. But yeah, I think like Improv, as I've said before, I think is borderline essential on Rebels these days, and Underworld Connections you have to have because you're running Bad Batch and IG in this. Already spoken a bit about Bad Batch. I wouldn't run them as damage, and they're obviously not support. I think they are just a brilliant objective playing unit, and because of their steady, because of their tactical, because of their ability to move in, move out, stay behind objectives, they're just super consistent, and yeah, shouldn't be dying unless you really get focused down, in which case you're probably going to get value from them anyway because they're just drawing so much fire, or if you maybe make a misplay and leave them out in the open. IG I've already spoken about. I think he's a damage dealer. He can be a bit of an objective player, but he's not that tough. Like his armor one's nice, but he's not like super tough, and the red saves again are fine with the impervious, but yeah, not phenomenal. Rebel troopers here are just objectives. They serve no other purpose. Try not to get them killed too early, because if nothing else, they're good for padding activation count. And you know, if you can leave one objective at the back for 40 points, not the worst thing in the world. As I talked about, fleets and damage dealers. Sleeper Cell, clear damage dealers can be a bit of an objective as well, because they'll tend to be in and around those objectives, but that's not their primary role here. Pathfinders are damage dealers. They shouldn't actually be that close to the objectives. They might be, you know, close to a back one, scoring it while shooting, but their primary job is to just be shooting. The ATRTs are really tricky, and it will be super game dependent. They can kind of do it all, but just none of it exceptionally well. Like, both of these ATRT options, the cannon and the flame, have potential for decent damage. They can both be support in the sense they provide line of sight blocking, and they enable your units to get cover. And they can also be objective players because they are a little bit tougher than your regular dudes. So you can just chuck them on an objective. And if you can get that flamer near an objective, then you're super happy. So yeah, I think this would be a kind of the closest idea I could come up with to what a meta rebel list would look like. And at 13 acts with some pretty tough, hard-hitting units in there, I think this could be super interesting because you're going to be I think the average now is about 11 or 12. To be honest, it doesn't really matter too much because it's either 11 with a pass or 12 and you've got an extra act either way. But being able to drop, you know, the Pathfinders late or Sleeper Cell late or even Bad Batch late if you want to, like, could be really nice with that extra activation count. So yeah, I think a fairly balanced list, and hopefully that sort of helps classify a bit clearer what I was talking about with the different types of units. This is more of a sort of a theory that I have and something I've kind of witnessed in games sometimes, and it's kind of something that I've thought about after games that I've played in. When Sleeper Cell came out, I was like, my goodness, those look really strong. I'm going to put 3 in my army. But in my experience, that doesn't work that well because if all of your units are doing the same thing, then your opponent only actually has to worry about you making kind of one kind of play. And while that play might be very powerful, it does make it easier to play around. And also by putting in if you put in just fleets and Sleeper Cell, you have lots of up close potential for damage, but it means your opponent has nothing to worry about turn 1. And to be honest, through most of turn 2, like unless they really sort of mess up their deployment and drop quite close to you, they're going to have the choice of almost the entire board if they want it turn 1, if you don't have anything that kind of threaten at longer range 4, range 5, to kind of plink stuff off. And also, if they are consistently outranging you, like if all your stuff is range 2 and all their stuff is range 3, they can dictate when you engage. Because if your Sleeper Cell have to go earlier in the turn, even if they, you know, move and then were to try and shoot, there's no guarantee they would be in range, but your opponent would be able to then move and shoot you at range 3. Yeah, and I think it's something that a mistake that I found myself making quite a lot when I initially started putting rebel lists together was just like, I'm going to put all this cool stuff in, I'm going to move up, and people just won't be able to deal with all the damage. The problem is, though, is that it's all very well having all that damage at the beginning of the game, but if you're getting consistently plinked as you move up the board, or even after you've deployed or whatever, then by the time your units get there, they aren't actually that scary. Like, it's like Wookiees or something, right? Like, initially they do have quite a bit of threat, but with no surges on those white saves, like, they can actually be whittled down fairly quickly. Same story with Sleeper Cell. Like, every model lost is 2 black dice gone, which is, a hit and a bit gone from your attack and stuff like that. Like, those little plinks early in the game can really start to rack up, and it can be super frustrating to see your really powerful units being whittled away. By having some longer range units, it forces your opponent to sort of respect where you could deploy a little bit more, because they know you're not just going to be sort of sprinting towards them as fast as you can. You might have to, it's all very well trying to stay behind line of sight blocking, but unless you've got a very friendly board with lots of line of sight blocking that gives you a clear route up the board, you're going to be taking casualties consistently as you move up. So having both kinds of units in your army isn't a necessity, but in my opinion does make your army more consistent and lets you also deal better with whatever your opponent is bringing. It also gives you something proactive to do on turn 1, and that's why I've been such a fan recently of double Pathfinder coupled with the bus and Leia in Rebels, because it enables you to have 2 units that you can guarantee will be shooting turn 1. And that means you can funnel any aims you get, any dodges you get, or anything like that into those units so that they can actually have more potential and you can actually provide a meaningful threat to your opponent. Because if you can get a couple of aims on Pathfinders and with targeting scopes and stuff like that, like, the potential damage output is actually quite scary. And even, like, gives you an opportunity to maybe, put an ion token on a unit of B2s, or maybe whittle down a unit of droidicas before they get in range, start suppressing you and things like that. And I think that does give you, having those proactive threats early on in the game is really nice, because as I'm going to come on to in a second, turn 1 is probably the most important turn in the game, and anything that happens on that turn 1 will just kind of ripple throughout the rest of the game. So if you can plink off a couple of wounds early in the game, that's 2 less models you're going to have to be dealing with on turn 2, turn 3, and so on. I think there's also an element of being realistic about what a unit can do in the game. As I've just mentioned, Pathfinders are almost always guaranteed to be able to shoot turn 1 unless your opponent is really hiding behind line of sight blocking and there's, like, a huge building or something that they can put them behind. What that means is that realistically Pathfinders should be able to attack as long as they survive all the way through the game. Every turn they should be able to shoot. Sleeper Cell, in contrast, they have done the maths. They have more than double the expected damage output of Pathfinders, and they cost less points, and they can get a free dodge from the Astra every turn. But realistically, if your opponent is sort of, unless they've really left themselves out in the open, Sleeper Cell, even if they're left alone, are probably only going to be able to attack 2 or 3 times in a game, and they won't be left alone. They will be shot. So while the high roll potential of Sleeper Cell, if they are able to get up and close and, stay reasonably healthy, is pretty exciting, the consistency of Pathfinders being able to attack every turn is something that I think is really valuable. And it's why I think I will continue to run at least 1 squad of Pathfinders in my lists going forward, just for that early game potential and for just being able to consistently deal out damage. As I mentioned before, like, it's this ripple effect, right? It's this idea of, like, if you are, by dropping your Pathfinders further forward, you force your opponent to sit back more defensively. It means maybe Sleeper Cell reach your opponent because they've had to take a less optimal decision. Maybe Sleeper Cell reach your opponent in a slightly healthier condition than they would otherwise, which lets you get more damage off and things like that. And, if you can whittle down a unit of clones, or you can take an action off a squad of B2s or whatever, like I mentioned, like, those effects really do start to add up throughout the game. Because each unit, unless they are, I guess, Maul, are only actually getting to make a total of 10 actions during the game. And if you can take away one of those actions by suppressing them or by giving them an ion token or something, you're taking away 10% of what a unit, even if it survived the whole game, would be able to do. And that's huge. So I think having those early game effects can be super powerful. It's also, I'll come on to this again a bit later, but having units that can just do lots of different things is really useful in game. Like having units that are good at one thing is absolutely fine if they're really good at that thing. But having a unit like IG who can sit back and blink, or who can move in and be a bit more of a threat, or Wicket who can just sit back and just synergize with Lair providing those dodges, or if he's loaded up dodges himself can run onto objectives and stuff like that. Like they can sort of do two different things. If we're looking at when you're looking at your objectives and how you're kind of thinking about how you can build your list for those different objectives, it's all very well picking the objectives that are ideal for your list, be that primary, secondary, and then obviously your greens. But your list needs to be able to cope with pretty much everything, because the veto now is so random. Like all it takes is your opponent rocking up with the other side of the cards. Like if you've arrived like, I don't know, like mark targets and bring them to heal or something, but they've turned up with destroy enemy base and sweep and clear or something, like they're being much more aggressive. Or you've arrived with shifting priorities and recover the research, and they're there with bunker assault, for instance. Like you need to be able to cope with that, because all it takes is you only get 2 shots of the veto, and so you really don't have that much control of what comes out. I think greens are less worth worrying about. Like I think advanced intel for me is by far the best at the moment, and definitely the most consistent. I think there are some I'm considering a bit more than I used to. Like fortified's quite interesting. I used to think cunning deployment was amazing, and now I'm not quite so sure. Like I think it's pretty good, but I don't know if it's amazing. It was. And then like garrison has some niche uses. Ordnance and strafing round are both sort of quite consistent. So yeah, I don't think not so much worrying about greens, but when you are building your list, you need to be able to cope with each kind of objective. And even if those vanilla rebel trooper units that I mentioned earlier, they can be huge in the late game. Like as I'm mentioning here, like because it's a unit scoring, unless they have an objective token or something, which can sometimes, or an intel token I think they're called, which can give you an extra point or something sometimes. Otherwise, it's just literally unit for unit, and so a rebel trooper sitting at the back can score as many points as a super B2 squad or a Vader who has to sit on their own objective as well. So even if it feels bad sometimes just chucking in some naked core units, there's nothing wrong with them milling around at the back and not really doing a lot else, because not every unit has to be in there in the fight trying to do something proactive. Sometimes they can just sit back and let the other units kind of get in the fight themselves. This one is something that I had a bit of a revelation about after I think I ran Op Luke 4 or 5 games in a row, and this was about the time where his points drop came in, and I was like, I wasn't winning, and I was like, what is going wrong? Like I was running Luke, force push, burst of speed, tenacity, and normally I'd run not force reflexes. Either force barrier or force guidance to get the surges. And I was like, what's going wrong? Like, why isn't this working? And the problem is that Luke is great. Luke is a really good unit, but with force push and all the stuff on him, he was coming in at over 220 points. And what it meant is that he was taking so much away from the rest of my list that in order to justify him being on the board, he was having to do so much each game that it just wasn't happening. And like, I think Luke has a really high skill ceiling to him. Like he can do so much. He can play objectives. Like his disengage is phenomenal. His 7 health is great. Courage 4, all that stuff is great. Like he is a very strong unit. But I wasn't good enough with Luke to get the value from him in that game. So as a result, even though he is a good unit, by putting him in my list, I was effectively making my list worse because I was having to take stuff out. And it kind of meant, actually, even if you compare Luke to Bad Batch, which is what the comparison I've made here, Bad Batch for 70 points less can perform not the same role. I don't think they're as good, but they are super tough, and like they have a greater threat range. Like they do have some advantages over Luke. And 70 points is an activation. That's sleeper cell. Like I 100% think, for me at least, I would rather have in my list Bad Batch and a sleeper cell over Op Luke with force push. Now, for some people, they will get value from Op Luke with force push because that's an incredible combo, and used in the right hands, it can be great for clearing objectives. But as I've said, I wasn't getting the value from Luke, and even though I had this great combo in my army, it just wasn't working properly. So it was quite an interesting one to think through after my games. And I was like, actually, for me, Luke wasn't doing that much because my opponent just, outdeployed me. And then even though Luke maybe did hold an objective by himself, the rest of my army just got cleared out because I just had to sacrifice stuff for putting Luke in. So that's not to say Luke is bad, but like the two I've really discovered this with, I think, are Han and Op Luke, because Han to a lesser extent because he's not as expensive, but they are both units that are definitely good in game. I'm not disputing that at all, but they didn't suit the way I was approaching the game, and I didn't have the skill to get value out of those two. Whereas for me, if I was to go to a tournament, I would definitely take Leia, Wicket, and Bad Batch as a combo. Firstly, because I think it's actually almost exactly the same price as Op Luke and Han. But for me, that combo is much more consistent, and I find it easier to kind of use those units, get value from those units in game, because it's just a different playstyle. But maybe those units are also more forgiving because you have more dodges and things like that, a bit more survivability. But yeah, as I've said here, I think Bad Batch maybe have a bit of a lower ceiling than Luke, but they do definitely have a much higher floor because they just have more health, if nothing else. And you can pull off the steady shenanigans, and you can score objectives at range 1. Like, they give you more options in terms of just hiding a bit further back and maybe being a bit more cautious. Whereas Luke, you sometimes do just have to absolutely send it. My current list of choice, and the one that I've kind of run, not a couple of times in a row recently, but I've kind of been moving towards recently. I think if I was to go to tournament, a list kind of looked like this. It's not a million miles away from the list I showed you earlier, which was kind of my version of what I think a meta Rebel list would look like. But I think this 4-hero combo for me is the best in Rebels right now, and definitely the most consistent for me. Fleets with a medic, mainly to get Bad Batch, or layer out of melee. If they get stuck in melee, then just Rebel troopers who'll sit at the back and keep IG and the speeder truck alive. Rebel troopers with an ion gun, they're a bit of a damage dealing unit. They should probably also be an objective unit. I might put that in as well, but currently it just says damage dealing. And then I've got my double pathfinders with transponder and targeting scopes. The idea is you try and funnel the aims onto these guys early in the game, and they can do a surprising amount of damage. Like, even at range 4, getting those rerolls on those white surging die, like, it's basically a hit per aim is what you're adding with the targeting scopes on those. A little bit similar to Bosk, although not as good. But yeah, just having that threat turn 1 of those 2 infiltrating Pathfinder squads can be really nice, and I've found it to be a really useful early game combo, especially with on the Bistan squad, which is, I think, significantly better than the Power squad. One squad of Sleep Cell, because I think Sleep Cell are probably one of the best units we're able to have access to right now, alongside Bad Batch, in terms of just sheer threat, and like they really suit the way Legion is played now in terms of like being up close and personal and scoring objectives. Like, they just are a really solid inclusion. And then the AA5, which I'm a huge convert to recently. I used to think it was rubbish, and then I used it for a couple of games in a row, and I was like, this feels really good. So, Unorthodox Tactician, Shriv, Laser Out, the range 4 laser, and HQ Uplink. HQ Uplink because Rebel Order Control is garbage, and I don't want, it happened a couple of times in my early games, the AA5 was stuck to the end of the turn, so I didn't get value from my aims and things like that. So turn 1 with this, you can just move on with HQ Uplink, and then you just do your your deploy move on, and then you can just recover to get HQ Uplink back up ready for next turn. So you can pull off that combo a couple of times in a row just to get those aims ready to go nice and early in the turn. In terms of command cards, IG's 1-pip's great. I've also taken Sabotage Communications, mainly because in this list, I'm only realistically going to be trying to actively give orders to either operatives or special forces. So in that case, it's actually just a strictly better ambush. I think it's ambush, isn't it? The generic 1-pip. Then both the layers 2-pips, beautiful friendships, normally the turn 1 play with this. I think you can also make an argument for IG's 2-pip. I think it's a machine made for killing, is what it's called. Like, that steady, not so much the demoralize, but the steady is great, and I've found it to be quite a nice turn 1 play because it just again gives IG such a big threat range. And then 3-pips, put in layers, somebody has to save our skins. Again, that's just a nice turn 2 play I found for getting the bus off nice and early after layer goes, so you can get those dodges and those aims nice and quickly. And then anti-capture protocols, because you have to put it in, but also it's kind of interesting. And with bounty programming, it does gain Pierce, so it can be quite an interesting up close and personal threat for later in the game if you're able to pull it off, but not happened for me just yet. Then in terms of yellows, mark targets, surface scan, sweep and clear. I think all of these suit this list pretty well. Maybe I would take sweep and clear out, possibly, but I think definitely mark targets and surface scan are pretty good bets. Yeah, and then for my greens, advanced intel, again, as I've said before, I think is a great bet. Cunning deployment, just because there's so much dodge synergy in this list. I don't know if it's necessarily includes so much now. I think it's good for putting dodges on units that you're maybe thinking of leaving a bit more exposed. Like the Pathfinders might, even though they're shooting early at range 4, they might just come under a little bit of like long range fire from a token range 4 heavy weapon or something. So having that dodge on there can be really helpful. And then fortified positions, just to get you a bit of heavy cover, and that sort of middle ground up towards the center is generally how I find myself using it. Can be super useful. And then the reds, I think, like just the ones that enable you to kind of shoot at long range, are really powerful for this list, which does have some nice long range options. It's not like a phenomenal long range shooting list, but I found these ones give me good flexibility to, with these Pathfinder squads, if I can leave them on a back objective on recover the research or shifting or something, that can be really powerful. But yeah, a bit of a rambly video today. Quite a lot of stuff to get through, and hopefully it all kind of made sense. I'm not claiming to be a Rebel list building expert or something, but this is just kind of me trying to go through sort of the process I've been on as I've come to think about Rebel list building and stuff like that. As I say, like there are definitely some alternative Rebel lists. I think like a more meta list might be Hanover, Wicket, and Leia, for instance, as an inclusion. But I think like triple ATRT, double Sleeper Cell, Bistan Pathfinders is definitely sort of quite a meta approach to Rebel list building right now. But let me know what you do with your lists in the comments below. I'd be really interested to see how this comes across. And yeah, drop a like, drop a subscribe. I didn't think I would find myself saying that, but we're into the cliches now. And yeah, see you for the next one.